Hi there, this is Michelle from East Ave Art, and today I'm going to show you the process I took to paint this very fall-inspired watercolor painting. And this was inspired by a trip that I took to Lake Placid during peak leaf season, and this is the photograph. This was the view from my hotel room that inspired me to do this painting. So I have my etcher sketchbook here, and I taped off with washi tape, the borders, and I'm just gonna sketch in, sort of my horizon line for the lake and where I see the mountains being. And it's just a pretty light sketch, but it just gives me some guidelines to start out. Once I'm happy with my sketch, I activate my paints with my spray bottle there, and one of the reasons why I do that is it does end up making the paints a little bit more vibrant if they are already activated with water. And I'm mixing up the sky blue color. That's the first thing I'm gonna paint here. And I just kind of love how in the fall the sky is just always such a crisp blue on a clear day. So that's what I was kind of going for to start out. So as I'm painting the sky, I'm using those very, very light pencil marks that I sketched in for, where the mountains would be. I'm using those to guide me as I paint, and you really can't see the pencil mark very well. I don't think you can see it at all on video. And that's kind of intentional. I mean, some people have preference, to where they don't want the pencil marks to show. I don't like graphite showing through my paint. Other people do. I mean, I think it's just like up to you what works best for you. So unfortunately, you can't really quite see what I used as my guidelines, but trust me, they're there. Once I got my sky painted in, I started really thinking about all the other colors I wanted to use. And this is going to be a really colorful painting. If you think about my reference photo inspiration, you really can see all of the fall colors. So there were some rust oranges, there's some yellows, there's some reds. And of course, being that Lake Placid is in the Northeast, you're also going to see the evergreens trees as well. So I have that really dark evergreen on my palette as well. And once that sky has dried, I'm actually going in for the first sort of like mountain peak. I'm going to do the mountains like one at a time, like the peaks that you see there. So the first one, I just laid down plain clean water, and I'm just dropping in the colors that I see. So I see a lot of like the rust and a lot of the yellow. And so I started with those lighter colors first, and I'll kind of fill in darker colors as I go. Now, the reason why I mentioned I waited till the sky was dry is if you paint next to already wet paint, those colors are gonna mix, and we don't want the sky obviously and the mountain mixing. But what we do want is the colors on this mountain range that I'm focused on to mix, because it's far away. You do want to kind of see this like blurry effect, like you can't really see individual trees. You're just getting the effect of many different trees of different colors. And so I'm just kind of slowly building up the color. I've noticed actually when I was up in the Adirondacks, which is where Lake Placid is, it's in the very, very northeast of New York State. One of the things I noticed is that the evergreen trees tend to be towards the top of the mountain peaks. So I really did concentrate that evergreen tree more at the top. And then also I noticed them as I was observing this mountain. Also there were just some, trees that still had green foliage at the base of the mountain as well, where the mountain was kind of like near the lake. And I think it's just because, the higher up you go, the colder it is. And so, you know, the leaves changed higher up the mountain. So that's kind of what I'm going for in this first pass at this first mountain range. You can just see I'm just dropping in the color, and this is just a really fun kind of painting to do, because you can really start to learn, especially if you're a beginner, this wet into wet process, and you can see how the paint interacts with other paints on a wet surface. And it's just kind of like a good way to practice, you know, how much water do you need to paint ratio, and various things like that. And a few times I felt like my colors were a little bit too bright, and it didn't really quite work with how far away the mountain was, you know, from me. So I decided to just, you can see I'm kind of pulling up some of the color a little bit just to tone it down, and also to give more of a blurred effect. So you see a bunch of different, you know, colors mixing together, but you're not right on top of that mountain, so it would have like a little bit more of a blurred look. So I let this mountain peak that I just finished dry completely before I moved on to the next mountain peak. And you can either just, you know, work on another painting, or you can use a hair dryer or a drying tool if you have one. Either way, you definitely want that one side to be dry, because you don't want them to mix, and you want them to look like clearly defined, you know, separate mountains, I guess. But I did follow the same process. As you could see, I put down clean water first, and now I'm just dropping in all the various colors. So I saw a little bit of a valley with some color in it in between these and somewhat behind these two mountain peaks. So that's why I added that little bit of burnt orange that you see in the middle. The other thing I want to point out is I made sure that my mountain peaks, that the lines I was painting were very uneven, because those are trees at the top and they're not all the same height. And I wanted to give that impression to the viewer. So next I'm going to use the same color as the sky to paint the lake. And this is actually Mirror Lake. Where I was staying in Lake Placid, I had a view of Mirror Lake. You actually have to drive a little bit further away to see the lake that is called Lake Placid. So the view that you have of a lake in the town Lake Placid is actually Mirror Lake, which is what I'm representing here. And so I'm going to move on to that evergreen color again and paint the trees that would be a little bit closer to the viewer, so they're right at the lake shore. And, you know, so this is a little bit of dry on wet on dry painting, actually, I should say, to give a little bit of perspective there. So that's a thicker consistency. It's not blending in with the background, but it is going to blend in with the lake. So you'll see I'm allowing some of that paint from the evergreen tree to touch the lake paint, because I want that lake to reflect not only the sky, but also the mountains that are sort of over it. So I'm adding some of the colors that I'm seeing from the mountain onto the lake painting section, but you can kind of see that I didn't work fast enough. The lake water had already dried, so I had to re-wet it a little bit, and I lost that white space that I was trying to maintain between what's actually at the lake shore versus what's being reflected on the lake. And I'll show you later in the painting process how I went about fixing that. So in this section, I had re-wet the lake paint, and I had added a little bit, darker color in there as well. And you can see that my I'm working a little bit more quickly, so I'm getting the benefit of wet into wet so that the reflection on the lake is a little bit smudgier, a little bit murkier, which is what your eye would pick up if you were looking at that in person. In addition to making a mistake a little bit not working quickly enough, I think another mistake I made is with these mountains that are further off. I think I actually should have painted them first, because it made it a lot more challenging for me to paint them in without activating and getting too much blending between all of the sets of mountain ranges. So that was a little bit of an issue that I think I had in the painting. And now I'm just going back in and touching up some of the paint at the lake shore so that you could see a clear difference between what's kind of closer to you perspective wise. I'm going in with a thicker consistency and actually painting in what looks like trees rather than smudges. So my next step is actually to paint the foreground, and I wanted to just make it look like this was sort of some trees overlooking this part of the Mirror Lake. So I painted in some evergreens, I painted in some regular sort of maples that are yellow and red, and I just really had fun with this part because these trees are going to be much more clearly trees because they're in the foreground, and so it allowed me to really differentiate perspective, I think, in seeing something up close versus at a distance. I think evergreens are super fun to paint. You just start with a line and then you just shoot off branches. The first few sets of branches at the top, I usually have them pointed vertically, and then as you descend down the tree, the branches and needles, they'll be facing more downward. And once I get them, the initial tree laid down, I like to add a little bit more depth of color. And now I'm going to move on to painting some of my maple trees. So I'm going to start with a nice red one. Those are my favorite, and I'm just gonna lay down some splotchy reds and try to get different variations of consistency, just to give that impression of leaves on the tree. And I'll do that for all the maple leaf trees. So I've got a yellow maple here, kind of like a yellowish orange, and I'll just kind of fill in the foreground with trees like this. So now that this first layer is dried, I'm going to add in some stems and branches, and then I'll add in some other layers of the color just to give it a little bit more visual interest. And so I'm going to fill in the rest of this area with evergreen trees, so that all of the space in the foreground is filled with different types of trees. So I mentioned earlier how I was going to go about fixing this mistake of not maintaining that little bit of white space between the lake shore and the lake. So the way that I'm fixing that is by using my white gouache. Now, gouache is a thicker consistency. You can get it in actually acrylic base or watercolor base. I use watercolor base gouache just because that's what I bought. I have never really used acrylic based, so I'm not really sure what the difference is. Might be something to think about checking out. But as you can see, it's thick enough to where I can bring back that spacing, that little bit of white. And you can also see I'm adding it to add a little bit of some ripple reflections there just to give it that lake look. And I think that's about it. I mean, I pulled off the washi tape and this is my final product. So hopefully you like this painting and the process is helpful for you to see. And I also hope you take a trip to the Adirondacks and Lake Placid. It was a pretty awesome place. So if you would like to see more, please like and subscribe, and thanks so much for watching.